All right, everyone, welcome back. We like to get a little dark and twisty in these deep dives, and today is no exception.
Yeah, you could say that.
We're talking crimes of passion.
Always a fascinating topic.
It is. And today's source material, oh boy, Crimes of the Heart, Love Gone Wrong.
Huh.
Just the title is giving me chills.
Some pretty intense cases in there. It really makes you think about the dark side of human nature.
No kidding. I mean, what pushes someone to do something so drastic, so
Yep.
irreversible?
That's what we're going to be exploring, right? What happens when love goes, let's say, a little too far?
Exactly. Let's jump right in. The source starts off talking about love triangles, sort of setting the stage, I guess.
Yeah, classic recipe for disaster, right? You got jealousy, betrayal, all these powerful emotions swirling around. And the source specifically mentioned the case of Betty Gore.
Right, Betty Gore.
Yeah.
Now, that case, if I remember correctly, took place in a small town, right? Like
It,
everyone knew everyone.
Exactly. Texas in the 80s, it really shook that community to its core. I mean, infidelity is always scandalous, but in a tight-knit town like that, it's like throwing a match on a powder keg. And the source really dives into the buildup. Years of resentment, hurt feelings, whispers, and rumors. You can practically feel the tension.
It's almost like you can see how it was inevitable, like a car crash in slow motion. You know it's coming, but you can't look away. But okay, so that's one example of a love triangle gone wrong. The source also mentioned another case. It was a little more, how should I put it? Complicated.
You're talking about Heather Elvis, Sydney Moore, and Tammy Moore. Yeah, that was a tangled web.
Okay, so remind me, who was involved with who again?
So you had Heather Elvis. She was young, in her early 20s. She'd been seeing Sydney Moore, who was married to Tammy Moore.
Ah, right, right. And then what, Heather just disappeared?
Yep, vanished without a trace. December of 2013. And it wasn't until years later that Sydney and Tammy were charged in connection with her disappearance.
Wow, okay, so another love triangle. But this one feels different, right? It's not just about a single act of passion. There's something more calculated, more, I don't know, sinister about it.
You're right, and the source really emphasizes that. This case isn't just about a moment of rage, it's about obsession, manipulation, control. Those are the things that can really turn deadly.
So what can we learn from this case? Like, are there red flags, warning signs we should all be aware of?
Absolutely. The source talks about possessiveness, controlling behavior, things people might dismiss at first, like, oh, they're just being protective or they just have a strong personality, but it can escalate quickly.
So we need to be able to recognize the difference between, say, healthy concern and something more toxic.
Exactly. The source lays out some key things to look for, like constantly checking their partner's phone, trying to isolate them from friends and family, getting overly angry at perceived slights, that kind of thing. These can be early indicators of a toxic relationship, which is really the breeding ground for these kinds of extreme behaviors.
Okay, so toxic relationships. What exactly does that term mean? I feel like I hear it all the time, but do we all even know what it actually looks like?
That's a great question. It's definitely a term that gets thrown around a lot. Basically, it's a relationship where there's a consistent pattern of disrespect, manipulation, and control. It's about one person's needs and desires constantly coming before the other person's, creating an imbalance of power. It's a really unhealthy dynamic.
Okay, I'm starting to get a clearer picture now. It's about recognizing those unhealthy patterns, those red flags that might point to something deeper and potentially dangerous.
Exactly. It's about awareness, both for ourselves and for those around us.
Got it. Now, the source mentioned something interesting about understanding these crimes. It talked about recreated diary entries, text messages, and letters.
Oh, yeah. That's a technique used in criminal psychology, to try and get inside the heads of these people.
But how does that actually work? Like, are they making things up?
Well, no, it's not about making stuff up. But experts take what they know about the case, the facts, the timelines, the personalities involved, and they use that to create plausible scenarios. Like, what might they have been thinking? What might they have said to each other in private?
So it's like a way to fill in the gaps, to understand the motivations behind the actions.
Right. It's not about excusing the behavior, but it's a tool to help us understand it, to get a fuller picture of what led up to the crime.
It really makes you think, right, about how easy it can be to get caught up in these intense emotions. I mean, could any of us, under the wrong circumstances, be pushed to that breaking point?
That's a tough question, and honestly one worth asking ourselves. It's not about living in fear, but recognizing that we all have emotions. Sometimes those emotions can get the better of us. The key is having healthy coping mechanisms, open communication, and knowing when to seek help.
Speaking of help, if someone's listening and they're seeing these red flags, whether in their own relationship or someone else's, Where can they turn? What resources are out there?
Oh, thankfully, there are tons of resources, hotlines, support groups, therapists who specialize in relationship issues. And the source actually lists a few specific organizations.
Perfect. We'll be sure to include those in the show notes.
Yeah, spread the word. Because the most important thing is to remember you're not alone and there is help available, no matter how hopeless things might seem.
So taking a step back, what's the big takeaway here? What should stick with us after we finish this deep dive?
I think there are a few things, really. First, unchecked emotions can have devastating consequences. Second, recognizing the signs of toxic relationships is crucial for ourselves and for others. And third, there's always help available. Never forget that.
It's a lot to process, isn't it? The line between love and hate.
Yeah,
It can be so thin sometimes.
absolutely. And something I think we should all consider is the role of societal pressures, the unrealistic expectations we place on relationships. All that can contribute to those blurred lines, making it even harder to see clearly.
Wow. You've definitely given us a lot to think about. This has been an incredibly eye-opening look at the darker side of human nature. And remember, everyone, if you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out. There's no shame in asking for help.
Couldn't agree more.
And on that note, that's it for this week's Deep Dive. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe out there.